So the next thing we're going to work on is the menu. So on the left, I'd like to show the list of links, just like we had before. So let's go back to the documentation, and we could obviously use the list component, right? So a list would be almost perfect. So with the list, you could basically show a list of elements. So in this case, we could show a list of names of writers with the links as we used to have before. But the problem with the list is that you can't really make the list items selected conditionally. Because one of the things I'd like to do is, for example, we have a home link, and if that home link is active, meaning that we're actually on /home, the route is currently /home, I'd like that link to be selected. And it's not very, it's not really built into list items in Material UI in and of itself. A better component for that task would be a menu. So a menu actually allows you to have items that are selected. So for example, I click on this element over here. You can see a list pops up and one of the items is pre-selected, and that's perfect. This is going to allow us to make some of the links active. Okay, so in our component, what I'll do is I'll have a menu list. Inside of the menu list, we're going to add menu items. So we'll have one for home. We're also going to have one for writers. So these are basically going to be links, right? So this one would be going to home. This one will be going to writers. We're going to need to import those components as well. I'll remove divider because we're not using it for the time being, so I'll pass in a menu list as well as a menu item inside. Okay, so we can save those. So now, how do we actually make the menu item a link? As it turns out, it's actually fairly simple. So if you go to the documentation on buttons, so open it in a new tab, and if you scroll to the very bottom, you're going to see a section on how to actually integrate Material UI with third-party libraries. And in this case, they're specifically talking about the withRouter DOM library. So if you wanted to make a button an actual link, what you need to do is you need to have a component property, and to that component property, you need to pass in the link component. The link component comes from withRouter DOM. It's just a simple link that you use to create, well, anchor tags or links. And you also pass in the to property. The to property is going to be added to the component, and it's going to be used for the link itself. The link will be the underlying implementation for the button. So this is going to make this button an actual link. So it's actually fairly simple, as you can see. Okay, so I'll close this for now, and I'll go back here to our menus. So what we can do here from this point on is we can actually start having links. So we'll turn this menu item component to an actual link. So we'll pass in a component property. Let's have a link. This is going to go to basically to our homepage, and then the second one is going to go to /writers, like that. We're going to need to import the link component from withRouter DOM. So let's pull that in, and let's see if this actually works. So I'll go back here. So now we have two links, and we can basically switch between them. Okay, so that's pretty good. So let's also add the links to our writers. So what I'll do is I'll actually gonna map through our writers. We're gonna need to pull them in as well. So let's actually have our writers. And I believe we already passed writers as a prop. Yes, and it seems like we do. So we're gonna have our writers property. We're gonna map through those writers. We'll have a writer object, and we'll return a menu item from here. Let's have a menu item like that. For the text, we're going to use the name of the writer. So I'm actually going to destructure it. So let's have ID and name. The ID would be pretty handy because we need to pass in the key. So let's have the ID serve as a key. We're also going to need to have our component property, and we're also going to need to have a to property. So for now, what we can do is we can basically put in a template string. So we'll have our /writers like before, but we're also going to need to put in the ID of the writer. And this is an expression, so we need to wrap it with curly braces as well. And finally, because we have a list over here, that's basically going to be a nested list. What we need to do is we actually need to have another menu list element at the top, and we're going to need to put in this logic basically inside of the menu list that's going to be nested on it. Now, as far as nested lists go, if you go back to the documentation, I think they already describe how you could do nested lists in Material UI. they probably describe that in the list section. So if we go to that section, let's see the source. Let's see what they're doing. So we are looking for a nested list. We have this nested class on a list item inside of a list, and that list is actually nested inside of another list, obviously. That's why it's a nested list. And then finally, for the styling, we basically apply a padding left. We use the theme spacing unit multiplied by 4. I think by default it's set to 8 pixels. So we can have that class, we can steal it from there. And we can also add it to the list of our classes in here. And we can use that nested list on menu item as well. So I'll put in class name. I'll set it to classes.nested. So this is supposed to apply the padding left styling on it. I'll close that for the time being, and this is what it's going to look like. It doesn't look too bad for now. Okay, so I'll fix the indentation over here just so that it's more readable and also understandable. And let's see, this is going to be like that. I'll put the arrow on the next line. Okay, it looks better. Now, so the problem we have right now is we can't actually see what page we're on, right? So it'd be useful if we could, like I said, make some of these items selected. Actually only one, depending on what URL you're currently on. So the way we could do that is we could actually add a selected property on the menu item. And the problem is, of course, we don't know what menu item is currently selected. So what we need to know is we actually need to know what URL we're on. Now, it's not that easy inside of layout component because the layout component is not nested inside the route. So what I mean by that is whenever you have a route component, let's say, what's a good example? Let's say the second one. We have a route component with a render prop and we pass in a function that returns a writers component. The writers component will also have access to things like match, which will contain the URL. It's being matched by the router. But in this case, in the case of layout component, we don't actually have that match URL property because we don't have a route component around layout, right? So in this case, the routers component has a route around it, so it's wrapped inside a route, but the layout is not. So we need to find a way to access the information about the current route from the layout component without actually having the route component around it. So one thing we could do is we could use withRouter HOC. So let's see, withRouter, let's search for that. And what we find is the documentation on React Router. So if I go to one of these links, you're going to see the information about this HOC helper function. So the way you use it is you basically import it from React Router DOM. And then if you wanted to have access to things like location or history, well, if you wrap your component with that helper method, then you're going to have access to all of those properties inside of it. So that's exactly the helper that we're going to use. So if we go back to our code, what we could do here is we can actually import that helper at the top. So I'll pull it in. And then we already have one HOC for the default export. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to use another helper. There is a compose function in the recompose library. If you're curious about that library, it's actually already imported in our project. If I search for it, you're gonna see it pop up on GitHub. It's basically a utility library that kind of serves as Lodash for React. So if we search for a compose function, the compose function basically allows us to compose multiple higher order components behind one function. So instead of actually nesting them one inside the other, you could basically have them on the same level, and then finally you would pass in your component as the argument to that overarching function that basically wraps all those components. Anyways, so actually it's very simple. So what we need to do is we need to have with styles. I'll pass in the styles, and then I'll also pass in withRouter. I'm actually going to pass in withRouter at the top. Although the order here doesn't really matter. You can have styles applied first or the router applied first, doesn't really matter. So we have the layout, and then I can remove the old one. And we're gonna pull in compose. So let's do import compose from recompose. If you're curious about the recompose library, it's actually already being installed. So it's actually one of the dependencies. If you search for it in node modules, you're gonna see it pop up over here. Now, if you actually use it in your project, it'll be a good idea to actually add it as a dependency, and that's what I'm actually gonna do. So I'll go back to the terminal, I'll stop the app, and I'll do yarn add recompose. Even though it's already a sub-dependency for one of our dependencies, it'd be more reliable to actually add it to our package.json file, and that way, if that dependency gets removed for some reason from that package in which it's being a sub-dependency, our project is still going to be solid because we're going to have recompose in our package.json. Okay, so it's just safer for our project. Okay, so now we have that recompose. We added withRouter helper or HOC. I'll go back to the terminal. I'll do yarn start to restart the server. And then once we have that in our terminal, we can actually pull in the information about the current location. So I'll have location path name, and this will give us the access to the current route. So to actually use path name, I'm going to add in a selected property. So let's say selected on the menu item. The home menu item needs to be selected as long as the to properties, so in this case it would be a slash, matches the path name, which would be the current route. So the same thing we could basically say about the writers link. So if slash writers matches path name, then this link needs to be active, and of course the same thing for the rest of the links. So in this case we actually need to match it against the to property. So we could obviously duplicate it, but I think what I'll do is I'll actually create a constant. So let's say constant 2. This would be the link of this menu item, and we'll pass it in as a prop. But we're also going to check in if selected to property. If the to property matches the path name, then this menu item needs to be selected. That's basically the idea. And it looks like I made a typo. We don't need this arrow. This name we're going to indent, and the to prop I'll put in at the top over here. So if I select, let's say writers, that's going to be selected, and the same thing for all of the other links. So now we can actually distinguish between the active links as well as those that are not active. So that's pretty much it for the drawer component. In the next tutorial, we're going to look at the writers component. What I like to do for the writers page is I like to display a list of cards of the writers with basic summary, like we're going to show an image, we're going to show the name of the writer, and we're also going to put in a link to the profile of that writer. So we're going to do that in the next tutorial, and I hope you stick around, and I'll see you next time. Take care.